You know, I always start my videos by talking how amazing React Router is and all of the ways you can use it and how you can leverage it to build great web applications. But I never really talk about what you don't need in it. And today I decided to make that video because I get a lot of questions from people like, hey, yeah, that's great, but do I need Redux in React Router? Do I need this? Do I need that? Do I need this library? Do I need that library? And today I kind of want to go over that and explain what you need and what you don't need. And this might start off as a controversial one because the first thing we're talking about is tanstack query. I've seen this question a million times. Hey, how do I use tanstack query with React Router version 7 framework mode? Or also known in some exclusive circles as Remix. But we're kind of forbidden from talking about Remix because it's kind of taking a nap and you don't want to wake it up. But jokes aside, let's talk about tanstack query. And the reason I picked tanstack query first is because I have this cool download number going up all the time, so I don't really have to have a static screen, so that's great. So let's get into it. So tanstack query, or also known as React query if you're like really old. But tanstack query is a tool that helps you fetch data on the client. So basically you can, well, not just fetch data, but also cache it and manage asynchronous state and all these cool little things that you can do with it. And it's more than just a fetching library, but at the end of the day, you don't need it. And the reason behind this is if you know what tanstack query is for, you're gonna know that there are better ways to do it inside of Remix by using the tools that Remix gives you out of the box, because Remix is already an opinionated framework on how you handle data fetching. It gives you everything you need to do it properly, and it's really hard to justify adding tanstack query into your project. And if I switch over to VS Code, let me just give you a brief example of why this is. So I'm using the base stack as an example, but this doesn't really matter. And we have our loader here, and this would be your equivalent of the callback function inside of tanstack query. So whatever you return from here gets passed to the client. So you basically get it inside of your component here as a prop, as the loader data prop. You don't really need to do something like this. So use query and then you give it the key, and then you, I know this is not the API, but just to get the point across, then you do this, and then you do something like fetch from server blah 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 blah, and then you maybe get this data from somewhere, and then you wait it to get it, and then this gets returned. And then the query hook does its magic, it stores it in cache, and then when you fetch it again, it's not fetched from whatever server there is, but it's automatically given to you because of the cache. Well, this is amazing. When I personally switched over to Remix, I had a really hard time letting go of use query and tanstack query. But after weeks and weeks of just trying to make it work inside of Remix and somehow find a way to use both of them, I just realized I was trying to over-engineer something that's already available out of the box, and I'm just doing myself a disservice because I'm making it more complicated than it needs to be. And why this is more complicated is because what you get out of the box is you get the loader function, and the loader function returns whatever data you need. And the reason why this is more flexible for data fetching is because this already happens on the server. So you're controlling both your server and the client fetching. And the reason why you wouldn't want to do fetching on the client here is because you can already fetch it in the loader, return it, and then it's available on the client before the component mounts and renders and everything. Otherwise, you're starting the fetch as soon as the component mounts. And that's one of the reasons. The other reasons is because you can, when it's returned from the server, you are very flexible in how you fetch data and how you cache it. Because, for example, on the server, you might want to do something like this. So you return this as data, and then you give it the headers, and then you say cache control is something like this. And then if you have a CDN, this gets cached there, or it gets cached in the user's browser, or it depends on how you obviously set up the cache control. Or if you don't want to cache it on a CDN, you can maybe not return data, but let's say the hints here are very long. You can, for example, store this in memory. So you can, for example, say const map is equal to new map, and then you just say, okay, I want to store hints here, so set hints as hints, and then instead of fetching it here, you just say, okay, if map get hints, then for example you early return this by doing return hints is map get hints, and then you also return the lang and client environment. And for example, now this is cached, and let's say this took like 200 milliseconds. Now it's gonna be instant, and you're gonna instantly return it to the browser. So you're very flexible on how you cache stuff in the loader. And what you can also do is, for example, you can use, I don't know, Redis, you can cache it on in some other place. There's a million things you can do on your server, and that covers the caching part of it. And if you want to return data, obviously this is also covered by the loaders. So there's absolutely no need for you to use query on the client. The only cool thing about tanstack query is if I switch back to the documentation, and if I go to examples, you can find the query client here, and that's in the core. And this is not really specific to React itself, but the query client is a really cool utility that you can use on the client to cache data. But the cool thing about it is it has these focus manager, online manager, and notify manager, and all of these managers. And you can use these utilities to help you do some stuff on the client. And another possible use case that you could have for tanstack query is, for example, if I go back to the editor, you're not caching anything on the loader, but you want to cache it on the client. Then you can do like export const client loader, and then inside of here you can basically use the query client. So you would import the query client, and then you would do something like query client set data, and then you would just return it from the client loader. And then you can, for example, use the query client in the client loaders to cache the data. Maybe that's a use case that's cool. But the more you try to fit tanstack query into Remix or React Router, you're gonna see that it doesn't really like work together perfectly. You're gonna see that it's kind of over-engineering to a point, because you're not really getting much of the benefits that the tanstack query brings, and you're just using it because you love it rather than because you need it. And that's the first library I wanted to go over. And this doesn't really apply only to tanstack query, but most of the client fetching libraries, because you already have all data fetching utilities and paradigms built into the framework. So there's really no need for you to go for tanstack query or any other data fetching library on the client, because you already have data fetching built into the framework. All right, another cool library, if I switch back to my browser, is tRPC. And just a quick disclaimer before I continue, I really love the libraries I talk about here, and I think they serve their purpose and they can be really useful in spas and other places. I just personally believe they're not as useful inside of the React Router version 7 framework code, because they don't really offer you all the benefits you would reap in some other certain environments that these things were built for. So tRPC, it's amazing. I really love the library. I think it's like one of the best ways to build type safety into your server plus client. But the issue with tRPC, and even if you scroll down here to the actual customer testimonials, if you look at Ken's comment here, perfectly describes why you don't need it. So if I didn't already get end-to-end type safety from Remix, I would 100% be investigating tRPC very seriously. If you're not on Remix, I suggest you give it a look. And I completely agree with his comment, because it's really amazing, but in Remix you absolutely don't need it. And let's switch to the editor and let me briefly show you why. Let's imagine you're building, let's create a resource route. So if you don't know what that is, it's basically a route that doesn't return a component, it just returns something like an API. So resource.create.ts, whatever, the name doesn't matter. And if I export a loader here, and it returns null. Or actually I'm going to export an action. And why you don't need tRPC? So imagine this scenario. So you have a schema, and then you do something like zod.object, name, email, and that's it. I don't really need it to be complex. And then I can do something like type form data is this, and then I can, let's say I want to build a fetcher that submits to this route. So I just export a use create fetcher, and I need to make it a const. And let's say I want to submit form data as form data, and then I just create a fetcher. So fetcher is equal to use fetcher. Now you can go as crazy as you want with this. I'm going to make it really simple because it's just an example. But what I can do now is I can return the fetcher, and then the submit. If you don't know, the fetcher returns a submit function. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna return fetcher, and then I'm gonna say submit is data, form data. And now that I say that, I realize I don't need this at all. And I'm gonna do the following. I'm gonna create the form data, I'm gonna append the name and the email, and then I'm gonna submit a post request to this action. And that's it. And then if I save this, now what I get out of this is, let's say I want to submit this type of data to my server, and also on the server you would get the request, and then on the server what you would do is you would say const form data is equal to await request form data, then you would get the form data, you would probably parse it, and then you would check if the result is successful. If not, return. If not, return some stuff. So maybe OK is false. Otherwise, const valid data is equal to result data. And there you have it. Full type safety from your server to your client. And then, for example, let's say I wanted to use this use create fetcher. All I would have to do is in some file say fetcher is equal to use create fetcher, and then fetcher submit. And now I have to give it the name. As you can see, it says, hey, give me the name. I have to give it the email. And there you have it. Full type safety from end to end. Basically tRPC built in, and it's just a matter of, hey, let's just create a custom hook for it. Now this is a bit of a dirty example because I just quickly wrote it. You can create your utilities that basically give you this out of the box, and with some generics and stuff like that, and it's like a 15-minute job. So there's really no need to use tRPC here. Even though I love it, even though I think it's awesome, I personally wouldn't use it, and this is the reason why. And now for our last but not least, Redux, or any sort of state management libraries. So if you're a React developer, you're working in SPA apps, you're coming to these server-side rendered environments, you might think, okay, how do I handle global state? And the cool thing about React Router version 7 framework mode is you don't. You really don't need global state, and if you do, it's already built into the framework. And how is that possible? Well, let me show you. So if I go back to the editor again, we're gonna delete this file that we just talked about. And what I'm gonna do is, here inside of root, I'm gonna go back to what it originally was. So we just reverted back to the original state. And let's say in the root, you return the language, for example. And so in the classic SPI environment, you would probably want to use the language in multiple components to do something, or maybe you want to use a hint somewhere. Well, in React Router version 7 framework mode, it's built into the framework. So for example, let's say you want to get access to this. All you have to do is you can export use root data. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to say const data is equal to use route loader data. I want to use the root one. And then if I hover over this, it's going to be any. So I don't want it to be that. I want it to be type of loader. If I hover over it again, now it's type safe. You see what I get back. And then if I use it somewhere where it's not available, I just throw no error, used in the wrong place. Otherwise, I return the data. And now you use this hook to access it inside of another route. So for example, let's say I want to use that data here. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go, for example, here. I'm gonna use the root loader data. I'm gonna say const data is equal to this. And then if I do data.this, I get everything fully type safe. And you can access this in any route. So whenever you return something from the loader, it's gonna be available wherever you need it. And then you can think of loaders as your context providers. And when you need something on the client to be available globally, you just find the highest loader that covers everything where this is gonna be used. So for example, let's say you have a dashboard route, you're gonna return from the dashboard layout route whatever is needed on every dashboard route, and then use it from there. You can also cache it in there and then fetch it quickly. Or for example, if it's needed in the whole app, you just go to the root, and then let's say you need, I don't know, what's the classic state, global state management that you need? Maybe user, and then user has name, and then it has email is email. And for example, now if I hover over the data here, again, if I hover over this, you get the user. So if you want to do something like that, data.user, you can. Or even you can create even more granular hooks. For example, export const use user. And then what you do is you basically do const, yeah, basically this. And then if I hover over this, this returns the user. And that is your state management in React Router version 7 framework code. You don't need Redux, you don't need Zustand, you don't need any of these libraries. What they can be useful for is if you're maybe creating some very specific feature that doesn't really submit to the server but waits for a certain point in time to submit. That would be a cool use case for maybe state management libraries, but I would still go for something lightweight, like either like Zustand or maybe Redux toolkit. But then again, it shouldn't be a default you go to. It should be a matter of, hey, I really need global state management libraries for this specific feature. There is no way for me to do it with the server, with the session, with the cookies and stuff like that. Then I can understand it. That's a good use case. Or you can just use the provided tools from React itself and then just create some utilities, like you use the context, you would subscribe to the context, almost identical to these. But it's really something you rarely need, except in some very specific scenarios. That's pretty much it. I went over some of the libraries you don't need. And I think the takeaway from this video is basically you don't need data fetching libraries for the client, you don't need global state management, and you don't need some specific server/client network utilities because you have access to both. So React Router's framework mode replaces all of these things, so you don't really need them in your apps. And if you use them, you're probably just over-engineering it, and you're gonna get to a point where you have to hack around either React Router or your libraries that you're using to make them play nice, because you're just adding more complexity than there should be. And that's it. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one. Bye!